Do you feel a shiver up your spine from fear? Yes, it's another story from the Nightshade diary. You know what that means. Check under the bed and make sure no one or nothing is there. Is the closet door securely shut? Then leave your disbelief behind. Amp up your imagination and hang on tight for another ride into terror and mystery. And like all good horror stories, just imagine it's a dark and stormy night. And remember, screaming like a little girl is permitted. The Upturned Face by Stephen Crane. What will we do now? Said the adjutant, troubled and excited. Bury him, said Timothy Lean. The two officers looked down close to their toes, where lay the body of their comrade. The face was chalk blue, gleaming eyes stared at the sky. Over the two upright figures was a windy sound of bullets, and on the top of the hill, Lean's prostrate company of Spitzbergen infantry was firing measured volleys. "Don't you think it would be better?" began the adjutant. "We might leave him until tomorrow." "No," said Lean. "I can't hold that post an hour longer. I've got to fall back, and we've got to bury old Bill." "Of course," said the adjutant at once. "Your men got entrenching tools?" Lean shouted back to his little line, and two men came slowly, one with a pick, one with a shovel. They started in the direction of the Rostina sharpshooters. Bullets cracked near their ears. "Dig here," said Lean gruffly. The men, thus caused to lower their glances to the turf, became hurried and frightened merely because they could not look to see whence the bullets came. The dull beat of the pick striking the earth sounded amid the swift snap of close bullets. Presently the other private began to shovel. "I suppose," said the adjutant slowly, "we'd better search his clothes for things." Lean nodded. Together in curious abstraction they looked at the body. Then Lean stirred his shoulders suddenly, arousing himself. "Yes," he said, "we'd better see what he's got." He dropped to his knees, and his hands approached the body of the dead officer. But his hands wavered over the buttons of the tunic. The first button was brick red with drying blood, and he did not seem to dare touch it. "Go on," said the adjutant hoarsely. Lean stretched his wooden hand, and his fingers fumbled the blood-stained buttons. At last he rose with ghastly face. He had gathered a watch, a whistle, a pipe, a tobacco pouch, a handkerchief, a little case of cards and papers. He looked at the adjutant. There was a silence. The adjutant was feeling that he had been a coward to make Lean do all the grisly business. "Well," said Lean, "that's all, I think. You have his sword and revolver?" "Yes," said the adjutant, his face working, and then he burst out in a sudden strange fury at the two privates. "Why don't you hurry up with that grave? What are you doing anyhow? Hurry, do you hear? I never saw such stupid—" Even as he cried out in his passion, the two men were laboring for their lives. Ever overhead the bullets were spitting. The grave was finished. It was not a masterpiece, a poor little shallow thing. Lean and the adjutant again looked at each other in a curious silent communication. Suddenly the adjutant croaked out a weird laugh. It was a terrible laugh, which had its origin in that part of the mind which is first moved by the singing of the nerves. "Well," he said humorously to Lean, "I suppose we had best tumble him in." "Yes," said Lean. The two privates stood waiting, bent over their implements. "I suppose," said Lean, "it would be better if we laid him in ourselves." "Yes," said the adjutant. Then, apparently remembering that he had made Lean search the body, he stooped with great fortitude and took hold of the dead officer's clothing. Lean joined him, both with particular that their fingers should not feel the corpse. They tugged away. The corpse lifted, heaved, toppled, flopped into the grave, and the two officers, straightening, looked again at each other. They were always looking at each other. They sighed with relief. The adjutant said, "I suppose we should say something. Do you know the service, Tim?" "They don't read the service until the grave is filled in," said Lean, pressing his lips to an academic expression. "Don't they?" said the adjutant, shocked that he had made the mistake. "Oh, well," he cried suddenly, let us say something while he can hear us." "All right," said Lean. "Do you know the service?" I can't remember a line of it, said the adjutant. Lean was extremely dubious. I can repeat 2 lines, but... Well, do it, said the adjutant. Go as far as you can. That's better than nothing. And the beasts have got our range exactly. Lean looked at his 2 men. Attention, he barked. The privates came to attention with a click, looking much aggrieved. The adjutant lowered his helmet to his knee. Lean, bareheaded, he stood over the grave. The Rostina sharpshooters fired briskly. Our father, our friend has sunk in the deep waters of death, but his spirit has leaped toward thee as the bubble rises from the lips of the drowning. Perceive, we beseech, O Father, the little flying bubble, and... Lean, although husky and ashamed, had suffered no hesitation up to this point, but he stopped with a hopeless feeling and looked at the corpse. The adjutant moved uneasily. And from thy superb heights, he began, and then he too came to an end. And from thy superb heights, said Lean. The adjutant suddenly remembered a phrase in the back part of the Spitzbergen burial service, and he exploited it with the triumphant manner of a man who has recalled everything and can go on. "O God, have mercy. O God, have mercy," said Lean. "Mercy," repeated the adjutant in quick failure. "Mercy," said Lean, and then he was moved by some violence of feeling, for he turned suddenly upon his 2 men and tigerishly said, "Throw the dirt in." The fire of the Rostina sharpshooters was accurate and continuous. One of the aggrieved privates came forward with his shovel. He lifted his first shovel load of earth, and for a moment of inexplicable hesitation it was held poised above this corpse, which from its chalk blue face looked keenly out from the grave. Then the soldier emptied his shovel on the feet. Timothy Lean felt as if tons had been swiftly lifted from off his forehead. He had felt that perhaps the private might empty the shovel on the face, had been emptied on the feet. There was a great point gained there. Ah, the first shovelful had been emptied on the feet. How satisfactory. The adjutant began to babble. "Well, of course, a man we've messed with all these years. Impossible. You can't, you know, leave your intimate friends rotting on the field. Go on, for God's sake, and shovel you." The man with the shovel suddenly ducked, grabbed his left arm with his right hand, and looked at his officer for orders. Lean picked up the shovel from the ground. "Go to the rear," he said to the wounded man. He also addressed the other private. "You get under cover too. I'll finish this business." The wounded man scrambled hard, still for the top of the ridge, without devoting any glances to the direction whence the bullets came, and the other man followed at an equal pace. But he was different, and then he looked back anxiously 3 times. This is merely the way, often, of the hit and unhit. Timothy Lean filled the shovel, hesitated, and then, in a movement which was like a gesture of abhorrence, he flung the dirt into the grave, and as it landed it made a sound. Plop. Lean suddenly stopped and mopped his brow, a tired laborer. "Perhaps we have been wrong," said the adjutant. His glance wavered stupidly. "It might have been better if we hadn't buried him just at this time. Of course, if we advanced tomorrow, the body would have been—" "Damn you," said Lean, "shut your mouth. He was not the senior officer." He again filled the shovel and flung the earth. Always the earth made that sound, plop. For a space Lean worked frantically, like a man digging himself out of danger. Soon there was nothing to be seen but the chalk blue face. Lean filled the shovel. "Good God," he cried to the adjutant. "Why didn't you turn him somehow when you put him in this?" Then Lean began to stutter. The adjutant understood. He was pale to the lips. "Go on, man," he cried beseechingly, almost in a shout. Lean swung back the shovel and went forward in a pendulum curve. When the earth landed, it made a sound. Plop. Florinda by Shamus Frazer. "Did you and Miss Reeve have a lovely walk, darling?" Claire asked of the child in the tarnished depth of glass before her. "Well, it was lovely for me, but not for Miss Reeve, because she tore her stockings on a bramble, and it bled." "The stocking?" "No. That ran a beautiful ladder," said Jane very solemnly, "but there were 2 long tears on her leg, as if a cat had scratched her. We were going along by the path by the lake, when the brambles caught her. She almost fell in. She did look funny, Mummy, hopping on the bank like a hen blackbird a cat's playing with and squawking. Poor Miss Reeve. Your father's going to have that path cleared soon. It's quite overgrown. Oh, I hope not soon, Mummy. I love the brambly places. And what the birds and rabbits will do if they're cut down, I can't imagine. The thickety bushes are all hopping and fluttering with them when you walk, and the path wiggles as if it were living too. So you must lift your feet high and stamp on it, the way Florinda does. But Claire was not listening any more. She had withdrawn her glance from Jane's grave elfin features in the shadowed recess of the glass to fix it on her own image, spread as elegantly upon its surface as a swan. And if Daddy has the bushes cut down, Jane went on, what will poor Florinda do? Where will she play? There will be no place at all for the little traps and snares she sets. No place for her to creep and whistle in and tinkle into laughter when something funny happens, like Miss Reeve caught by the leg and hopping. This was the time when her mother was not listening, that Jane could talk most easily about Florinda. She looked at her mother's image, wrapped in the dull mysteries of grown-up thought within the oval Chippendale glass, and thence to the rococo frame of gilded wood, in whose interlacing design two birds of faded gilt, a bat with a chipped wing, and flowers whose golden petals and leaves showed here and there little spots and tips of white plaster like a disease, were all caught forever. That's how I met Florinda. She was chattering quite confidently, now that she knew that it was only to herself. I had been down to the edge of the lake where there were no brambles, you know, the lawn side, and I knelt down to look at myself in the water, and there were two of me. That's what I thought at first, two of me. And then I saw one was someone else. It was Florinda, smiling at me, but I couldn't smile back, not for anything. There we were like you and me in the glass, one smiling and one very solemn. Then Miss Reeve called and Florinda just went, and my face was alone and astonished in the water. She's shy, Florinda is, and sly, too. Shy and sly. That's Florinda for you. The repeated name stirred Claire to a vague consciousness. She had heard it on Jane's lips before. Who is Florinda? She asked. Mummy, I've told you. She's a doll, I think. Only large. Large as me. And she never talks. Not with words, anyway. And her eyes can't shut, even when she lies down. I thought she was called Arabella. That's the doll Uncle Richard gave me last Christmas. Arabella does close her eyes when she lies down. And she says, "Good night, Mama," too, because of the gramophone record inside her. But Florinda's different. She's not a house doll. She belongs outside, though I've asked her to come to tea on Christmas Eve. Well, darling, I've lots of letters to write, so just you run along to the nursery and have a lovely tea. So Florinda was a doll, an idea doll, it seemed, that Jane had invented in anticipation of Christmas. 9 in the new year. Jane was growing perhaps a little old for dolls. A strange child, thought Claire, difficult to understand, and that she took after her mother, though in looks it was her father she resembled. With a sigh, Claire slid out the drawer of the mahogany writing desk. She distributed writing paper and envelopes, the Christmas cards, reproductions of Alcan prints in neat piles over the red leather, and opening her address book, set herself to write. Roger came in with the early December dusk. He had been tramping round the estate with Wakefield the agent, and the cold had painted his cheeks blue and nipped his nose red, so that he looked like a large clumsy gnome. He kissed Claire on the nape, and the icy touch of his nose spread goose flesh over her shoulders. "You go and pour yourself some whiskey," she said, "and thaw yourself out by the fire. I'll be with you in a minute." She addressed 2 more envelopes in her large clear hand, and then without looking round said, "Have we bitten off rather more than we can chew?" "There's an awful lot to be done," said her husband from the fire. "So much one hardly knows where to begin. The woods are a shambles. Nests and huts, nastiness and barbed wire. One would have thought Uncle Eustace would have made some effort to clear up the mess after the army moved out. But, darling, He never came back to live here. He was too wise, too ill, and too old, and he never gave a thought to those who'd inherit the place, I suppose. He never thought we'd be foolish enough to come and live here anyway. Roger's uncle had died in a nursing home in Bournemouth earlier in the year, and Roger had come into these acres of Darkshire Park and woodland, and the somber peeling house, Fowling Hall, set among them. At Claire's urging, he had tried to sell the place, but there were no offers. Now Roger had the obstinate notion of settling here, and trying to make pigs and chickens pay for the upkeep of the estate. Of course, Claire knew there was something else behind this recent interest in the country life. Nothing had been said, but she knew what Roger wanted. And she knew, too, that he would hint at it again before long. The forbidden subject. She stacked her letters on the desk and went to join him by the fire. "There's one thing you can do," she said. "Clear that path that goes round the lake." Poor Miss Reeve tore herself quite nastily on a bramble this afternoon, walking there. "I'll remind Wakefield to get the men on the job tomorrow. And what was Jane doing down by the lake just now, as I came in? I called her and she ran off into the bushes." "My dear, Jane's been up in the nursery for the last hour or more. Miss Reeve's reading to her. You know, she's not allowed out this raw weather except when the sun's up, the doctor said. Well, I wondered. I only glimpsed her, a little girl, in the dusk. She ran off when I called. One of the workmen's children, I expect." "Perhaps. Strange I didn't think of that." He took a gulp of whiskey and changed the subject. "Claire, it's going to cost the earth to put this place properly in order. It would be worth it if," he added with an effort, "I mean, if one thought it was leading anywhere." So it had come out, the first hint. "You mean if we had a son, don't you? Don't you, Roger?" She spoke accusingly. "I merely meant, well, yes, though of course." She didn't let him finish. "But you know what the doctor said after Jane. You know how delicate she is. You can't want—" "If she had a brother," Roger began. Claire laughed, a sudden shiver of laughter, and held her hands to the fire. "Roger, what an open hypocrite you are. If she had a brother, when all the time you mean if I had a son. And how could you be certain it wouldn't be a sister? No, Roger. We've had this out 1,000 times in the past. It can't be done." She shook her head and blinked at the fire. It wouldn't work out. Roger went into the nursery, as was his too irregular custom, to say good night to Jane. She was in her pink fleecy dressing gown, slippered toes resting on the wire fender, a bowl emptied of bread and milk on her knees. Miss Reeve was reading her a story about a princess who was turned by enchantment into a fox. "Don't let me interrupt, Miss Reeve. I'll look in again later." "Oh, do come in, Mr. Whaley. We're almost ready for bed. I was sorry to hear about your accident this afternoon. It was such a silly thing, really. I caught my foot in a slip noose of bramble. It was as if somebody had set it on the path on purpose. Only that would be too ridiculous for words. But it was a shock, and I tore myself painfully trying to get free." There was still the ghost of that panic, Roger noticed, in Miss Reeve's pasty, pudgy features, and signaling behind the round lenses of her spectacle. "It's not a very nice path for a walk," she added, "but one can't keep Jane away from the lake." "I'm having all the undergrowth cleared away from the bank," said Roger. "That should make it easier walking." "Oh, that'll ever be so much nicer, Mr. Whaley." "Florinda won't like it," thought Jane, sitting stiffly in her wicker chair by the fire. "She won't like it at all. She'll be in a wicked temper, will Florinda." But she said aloud in a voice of small protest, for what was the use of speaking about Florinda to grown-ups? "It won't be nice at all. It will be quite horribly beastly." The men didn't care for the work they had been set to do. It was the skeletons, they said, and they prodded suspiciously with their implements at the little lumps of bone and feather and fur that their cutting and scything had revealed. There was a killer somewhere in the woods. Owls, said one, stoats, said another, but old Renshaw said glumly it was neither bird nor beast. There was something that walked that shouldn't, and this infected the others with a derisive disquiet. All the same, 50 yards of path were cleared during the morning, which took them beyond the small Doric pavilion, that once served as boathouse and was reflected by a stone twin housing the lock mechanism on the eastern side of the lake. Miss Reeve took Jane out in the afternoon to watch the men's progress. Jane ran ahead down the cleared path, paused at the pavilion to hang over the flaking balustrade, and gazed down into the water, whispered something, shook her head, and ran on. "Hello, Mr. Renshaw." "Alone?" she cried, as rounding a sudden twist in the path, she came upon the old man hacking at the undergrowth. Renshaw started and cut short, and the blade hit into his foot. This accident stopped work for the day. "It wasn't right, Miss Jane, to come on me like that," he said as they were helping him up to the house. "You gave me a real turn. I thought—" "I know," said Jane, fixing him with her serious, puzzled eyes. "And she was there, too, watching all the time. Whatever the killer was, it moved its hunting ground that night. 2 Ed Orpingtons were found dead beside the arks next morning, their feathers scattered like snow over the bare ground. And it's not an animal, neither," said Ron, the boy who carried the mash into the runs and had discovered to kill. "What do you mean, it's not an animal?" asked Wakefield. "I mean that their necks is rungs, Mr. Wakefield." "Oh, get away," said Wakefield. But the following morning another hen was found lying in a mess of feathers and blood, and Wakefield reported to his master. "It can't be it's a fox, sir. That has not been bitten off. It's been pulled off, sir, and there was this, sir, was found by the arks. It was a child's bracelet of black and silver." The path was cleared, but on the farther side of the lake the shrubberies that melted imperceptibly into the tall woods bordered it closely. Here Jane dawdled on her afternoon walk. At the bend in the path near the boathouse she waited until her governess was out of sight, and then called softly into the gloom of yew and rhododendrons and laurel. "I think you're a beast, and I'm not going to be your friend any more, do you hear? And you're not to come on Christmas Eve, even if you're starving." There was movement in the shadows, and she glimpsed the staring blue eyes and pinched face and the tattered satin finery. "It's no use following us, so there!" Jane stuck her tongue out as a gesture of defiance and ran away along the path. "Are you all right?" asked Miss Reeve, who had turned back to look at her. "I thought I heard someone crying." "Oh, it's only Florinda," said Jane, "and she can sob her eyes out now for all I care." "Jane," said Miss Reeve severely, "how many more times have I to tell you that Florinda is a naughty fib, and we shouldn't tell naughty fibs even in fun?" "It's no fun," said Jane, so low that Miss Reeve could hardly catch a word. "No fun at all being Florinda." A hard frost set in overnight. It made a moon landscape of the park and woods, and engraved on the nursery window panes sharply, as with the diamond intricate traceries of silver fern. The bark of the trees was patterned with frost like chainmail, and from the gaunt branches icicle daggers glinted in the sun. Each twig of the bare shrubs had budded its teardrops of ice. The surface of the lake was wrinkled and gray like the face of an old woman. "And Wakefield sees, if it keeps up, we may be able to skate on it Boxing Day." But by midday the temperature rose, and all out of doors was filled with a mournful pattering and dripping. Towards evening a dirty yellow glow showed in the sky, and furry black clouds moved up over the woods, bringing snow. It snowed after that for 2 days, and then it was Christmas Eve. "You look like the Snow Queen, but you smell like the Queen of Sheba." "Must you go out tonight, Mummy?" "Darling, it's a bore. We promised Lady Graves, so we have to." "You should have kept your fingers crossed. But you'll be back soon?" "In time to catch Father Christmas climbing down the chimney, I expect." "But earlier than that. Promise?" "Much earlier than that. Daddy wants to get back early anyway. He and Wakefield had a tiring day sitting up with a gun to guard their precious hens." "But she—" "It never came, did it? Not last night. And now, you go to lovely sleeps, and when you wake perhaps Father Christmas will have brought you Florinda and his—" "No," cried the child, "not Florinda, Mummy, please." "What a funny thing you are," said Claire, stooping to kiss her. "You were quite silly about her a few days ago." Jane shivered and snuggled down in the warm bed. "I've changed," she said. "We're not friends any more." After the lights went out, Jane imagined she was walking in the snow. The snowflakes fell as lightly as kisses, and soon They had covered her with a white soft down. Now she knew herself to be a swan, and she tucked her head under a wing and so fell asleep on the dark rocking water. But in the next room Miss Reeve, who had gone to bed early, could not sleep because of the wind that sobbed so disquietingly around the angles of the house. At last she put out a hand to the bedside table, poured herself water, groped for the aspirin bottle, and swallowed down 3 tablets at a gulp. It was as she rescrewed the top she noticed that it was not the aspirin bottle she was holding. She could have sworn that the sleeping tablets had been in her dressing table drawer. Her first thought was that someone had changed the bottles on purpose, but that, she told herself, would be too absurd. There was nothing she could do about it. The crying of the wind mounted to shrill broken fluting that sounded oddly like children's laughter. The first thing they noticed when the car drew up, its chain tires grinding and clanking under the dark porch, was that the front door was ajar. "Wait here," said Roger to the chauffeur. "There seems to have been visitors while we were away." Claire switched on the drawing room lights and screamed at the demonic havoc they revealed. The chairs and tables overturned, the carpet a litter of broken porcelain, feathers from the torn cushions and melting snow. Someone had thrown the heavy silver inkwell at the wall glass, which hung askew, its surface cracked and starred, and the delicate frame broken. "No sane person," Roger began, but already Claire was running up the stairs to the nursery and screaming, "Jane! Jane!" as she ran. The nursery was wrecked too. The sheets clawed in strips, the floor drift of feathers from the ripped pillows. Only the doll Arabella with a shattered head was propped up in the empty bed. When Claire touched her, she fell backwards and began to repeat, "Good night, Mama," as a mechanism inside her worked. They found Jane's footsteps in the snow leading over the lawn in the direction of the lake. Once they thought they saw her ahead of them, but it was only the snowman Roger had helped her to build during the afternoon. There was a misty moon, and by its light they followed the small naked footprints to the edge of the lake, but their eyes could make out nothing beyond the snow-fringed ice. Roger had sent on the chauffeur to abandon the drive where the car headlights could illuminate the farther bank, and now in the sudden glare they saw in the dark center of ice the 2 small figures, Jane in her nightdress, and beside her a little girl in old-fashioned blue satin, who walked oddly and jerkily, lifting her feet and stamping them on the ice. They called together, "Jane! Jane! Come back!" She seemed to have heard, and she turned, groping towards the light. The other caught her by her arm, and the two struggled together on the black glassy surface. Then from the stars it seemed, and into their cold hearts fell a sound like the snapping of a giant lute string. The 2 tiny interlocked figures had disappeared, and the ice moaned and tinkled at the edges of the lake. Dead Man's Bones by Edith Olivier. I knew that my grandmother was dying, and I, who had never seen death, sat fearfully by her bed, wondering when the end would come. Would it be tonight? Could she live till tomorrow? I could not say. All I knew was that I had heard my parents say to each other that she could never recover, and that she must not be left alone. She had always been fond of me, and she wanted me to stay with her, and yet this silent watch filled me with restless terrors. I dared not move for fear of disturbing her, although I wished that she would rouse herself and say some word to break the silence of the room. The light tried her eyes, and so we had no lamp, but the firelight shone fitfully, now flaming up and then dying down. As the flames came up, they threw grotesque shadows on the walls. Granny was propped up against the pillows, and her face had grown terribly thin. Now and again its shadows was thrown, magnified and emaciated, onto the wall behind her bed. Her cap seemed all peaks, and her face was hawk-like. Those shadows fascinated me, but they frightened me also, and filled the room with uneasy fears. It was a rough night, too, and I had always felt frightened by the sound of wind howling round the house. It reminded me of something terrible which had once happened, something which I had remembered when I was surely too young to have had any memories of my own. A memory of a previous existence, perhaps. Suddenly grandmother spoke. "I don't like that wind," she said. "It reminds me of a terrible thing which once happened. Come and sit by me and listen. I don't want to die without telling someone about the most unforgettable experience of my life." She lay silent. "How old are you?" she asked. 16, I said. "I was only 12. and Southover Church had not long been built. People used to come from far and near to see it, for it was unlike any other church in the countryside. Lord Southover had always been a great collector, bringing home treasures from every country in Europe, and when he built this church for his native village, he filled it with rare and curious things, which seemed almost out of place in the little village. There were curious carved columns of porphyry which he had brought from a Baroque palace in Spain. The twisted pillars of black marble had once stood in a Florentine church, and the deep, dead colors of the mosaic pavement had shone on the floor of a house in ancient Rome. The font was roughly carved from a huge piece of red marble, and was said to have held libations and some strange heathen rite. The 13th century glass in the window had glowed like jewels in the walls of a chapel dedicated in a little Provençal town by a company of returning crusaders. Grotesque episodes in the lives of the saints were carved in deep relief on the doors, which he had found in a far-off town in Silesia. The church itself was like one of those Baroque buildings that one finds in South Bavaria, and it was set among lines of quiet grey poplars, while close beside it a thicket of ancient yews suggested the site of an earlier burial ground. There had always been a tradition that an ancient church had stood among those yews, and sure enough, as they dug the foundations, the builders came upon a large quantity of human bones. This seemed to prove that the new church was being placed on ground which had already been consecrated, and these bones were now carefully collected and placed in a stone sarcophagus or casket. A crypt had been built under the altar as a mausoleum for the Southover family. It had a low doorway leading into the churchyard, and over this was now placed a sarcophagus containing the ancient bones. As you came down the formal path which led to this door, walking between two stiff Victorian flower borders, you could read the elaborate inscription which told of the finding of these nameless bones, yet ended with the words, "And he said unto me, Son of man, can these bones live? And I answered, O Lord God, thou knowest." My grandmother stopped. I wished she would not go on, and yet I longed to know the end of her story. I sat breathless, and after a moment the thin old voice began again. My father, it went on, was the first rector of the new church, and well I remember its dedication. That was a great day in our childish lives, a day of pealing bells, of robed bishops, and of public luncheons, for the whole neighborhood came to see the church, which was already something of a legend. Southover never seemed to be a new church, and indeed it was not, for the outer walls alone had been newly built. Its interior was crowded with the creations of men of varying minds and differing faiths. It held the memories of 100 generations. Far-fetched was indeed the word to describe it, and many people called it out of place in the little English village. And yet it was its strangeness which gave it beauty and mystery. That was what Lord Southover had sought for and found. Yet I remember my own grandmother saying to my father, she was older than I am now, "Such things should not be mixed. They don't meet well. They look wrong, and they bring evil. You cannot tell what you have let loose in your church." My father laughed at her at the time, but sure enough, within 2 months of the consecration of the church, Lord Southover was dead, and his was the first coffin to be placed in the crypt under the altar. It was a long, narrow chamber, with at the very end a very grotesque representation of the Good Shepherd found in one of the catacombs. A series of shallow recesses down the sides of the crypt awaited the coffins, and Lord Southover's was now placed in the innermost of these, in no way enclosed, but visible to anyone entering the crypt. Lady Southover was a beautiful creature, and to this day I can remember the impression made on me by the sight of her tragic beauty and the heavy mourning clothes which were worn in those days. She could not bear to leave her husband's coffin, and she insisted on spending hours in the crypt every day, kneeling beside it. Every morning my father himself unlocked the crypt and left the vault open for her to enter when she would. She always came and went by the private way which led from the great house to the church, and no one saw her pass. Everyone kept out of the way. In the evening my father locked the door for the night. Some little time had passed when my parents had both to be away for a few days. I was always proud that, as the eldest of the family, I was already looked upon as able to shoulder a good deal of responsibility, and now I felt it befitted me that it was to me rather than to the old sexton that my father committed the key of the vault. Unlock the door at 8 in the morning, he said, and lock it at 7 every night. Lady Southover won't come later than that, for it will be dark. Do not give the key to anyone else, and keep out of the way when Lady Southover comes. 2 days passed. I unlocked and locked the door with conscientious punctuality. Then came an evening when I went out fishing with my brother, and we stayed so long away that we returned to find ourselves in dire disgrace with our very severe old nurse. To bed at once and without supper was the sentence, and I was so mortified at being thus punished before the little ones that I forgot the crypt. I woke in the middle of the night, and there swept over me the memory of that open door. The crypt had not been locked. It was my fault. I don't think you can realize in these easygoing days the overwhelming sense of guilt with which I then looked upon a failure to do my part in a family undertaking. For a few moments I was completely overcome with despair at the knowledge that I had failed in my trust. But as I grew more awake I realized that it was not yet too late. I still could lock the door. The key was on my table and the church nearby. I sprang out of bed, threw on a few clothes, and crept quietly downstairs into the garden. It was not dark. The moon was a few days after the full, and I never saw her shaped so uncannily. No beauty in her. She looked deformed and wicked. It was a windy sky, and the clouds fled one after another across the moon, so that her light came uncertainly, broken by patches of darkness. I went quickly along the garden path which led to the churchyard. The 3 old yews, their boughs spreading to the ground, stood like vast motionless presences, their shadows moving beneath them as the moon came out or disappeared behind a cloud. The words, "the shadow of death," came into my mind as I saw those dark, terrible trees. The poplars behind them were, on the contrary, very thin and transparent. They were full of movement. Little frightening breaths went through them, as though something invisible were passing. As I ran up the walk to the crypt, a horrid swarm of bats rushed out, their twinkling flight making them seem like dark stars thrown up from the fretful little universe, to flutter purposeless beneath the majestic march of the distant heavens. I ducked my head, covering it with my hands, and dived to the door of the crypt. As I put my hand upon it, I saw for 1 second in the darkness a light. It was close beside the coffin. As I looked, it went. The darkness closed over it, and all was still. My heart, too, stood still. Terror seized me. Then I realized that Lady Southover might still be there. Perhaps it was earlier than I thought, for I had not looked at the clock before coming downstairs. It might be an hour when grown-up people were still about. Pulling myself together for a supreme effort, I held open the door and called as loudly as I could. "Is anybody there?" The sound of my voice completed my panic. The vault echoed with the words, the echo coming so close upon them that they were magnified and distorted. A chill silence followed them, but now I could wait no longer. I banged the door, locked it, and fled. For a few steps only. Then I realized that I had not given time for a reply. In my terror I had locked the door upon the living occupant of the tomb, if living occupant there were, and had left him or her alone for the night in that most gruesome place. I know that when I went back, I did the bravest thing of my life, but back I went. The pulses in my head were making such a noise that I doubted whether I could hear an answer from within. My own blood deafened me, but I was resolved that when I called again, it should be with the door shut between me and that hideous black silence. I approached the door to find that the initiative was mine no more. From the vault, which a moment before had been so deadly still, there now issued a tumult which filled the churchyard. The door of the crypt was being violently shaken, and voices, many of them, were crying insistently from within. No, this was not Lady Southover. I thought the language was not really English, and yet I could make out some meaning in the hasty, desperate words. The voices were unlike any that I had ever heard. Were they shrill or deep? I could not say. They were toneless, and yet dominant as the wind, and they were urgent with an urgency I had never before or since imagined. "Open the door! Open the door! They have mixed the bones." With the voices there came 1,000 fluttering sounds. as if another host of bats were being driven against the door. I was shaking so much that even had I wished to do so, I could not have put the key into the lock, but I knew that I could never open the door upon this unknown horror. I thought I was going to fall to the ground, and to save myself, I clutched at the top of the low doorway. It seemed as if the whole church swayed with my weight. Open the door! Open the door! His bones shall not rest with hers. The agony in that voice was so terrible, so compelling, was that cry, that in spite of my terror, I found myself fumbling for the lock. The key touched it. Did I turn it? I do not think so, though I cannot say. But at the same moment that frenzied entreaty from within became a violent hurricane, and the door burst open with a crash. I was caught into the rush of a whirlwind, and the something which came out of the crypt swept me helplessly along. Then the engraved stone, at which I had clutched for support, came thundering to the ground, bringing with it the sarcophagus behind. It felled me to the earth, and there I lay, helplessly pinned under it. The casket had broken, and the bones were littered all about. By this time the driving clouds had almost covered the moon, and had become much darker. I lay under the fallen stone, my eyes staring into the uncertain twilight. I dared not close them, and I watched, rigid, unable to look away. But I could not see the figures, 2 or 3 of them, which moved, crouching, bending, turning over the bones. I was aware of their movements, but I could not distinguish themselves. They were so near me that I could feel a little stir of damp, cold air as they passed about, almost treading upon me as they went. I shrank away as far as I could from their wavering, uncertain course. But I could not really move, pinned as I was beneath that stone. Perforce I watched their horrible gestures, as they handled the bones one by one. Now they would lift one tenderly, fondling it with caresses which seemed indescribably evil. Then they grabbed at another with ribald loathing and scorn, tossing it mockingly away, or hurling it brutally to the ground and trampling it underfoot. Sometimes they bent close to the earth, near, dreadfully near, to where I lay, and then they whispered furtively, muttering and gibbering. I thought the scene would never end. Then the pain in my shoulder became unbearable. I fainted. My grandmother was silent. I looked anxiously toward her. Was she dead or dying? Surely the telling of the story must have been beyond her failing strength. But no, she lay there quietly, her face less distressed than I had seen it some time during her illness, as though by speaking she had eased her memory of a heavy weight. After a few moments she spoke again. The sexton found me lying there next morning, she said, and thought that I had been overtaken by the storm on my way to lock the door of the crypt. I never told my story to anyone. It was always supposed that only the storm had loosened the sarcophagus. And the casket, I asked? Were the bones put back, and was it returned to its place? It was not broken when they found it, replied grandmother. Then do you think that the bones are there safely to this day? I know they are not, she answered.